Hello and welcome. My name is Reid. I'm from the British Association of Social Workers. I'm a professional officer, and I have with me today Sarah Brown from the University of Kent, who is Head of Social Work. And I have with me also Holly Sykes from the University of York, who is a lecturer and placements coordinator. And last but not least, I have Peter Bradley from Oxford Brookes University, who is an associate lecturer there. And Peter is also an independent practice educator. So hello and welcome to the three of you.
Hi.
I'm going to hand over now to Sarah Brown, who is going to take us through a presentation of the Practice Educator Professional Standards, the PEPS, and a recent update that she has led on to that. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen, make sure I've got all the things singing and dancing in the right places. Right, okay, so welcome and thank you for listening. So I'm really pleased that Wayne talked about the acronym first. So do excuse me if I slip into talking about PEPS. It's much easier to say than Practice Educator Professional Standards, but that is what the presentation is about today. So this is the review that I led on behalf of the Professional Capabilities and Development Group, which started about April this year and ended in July. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is just why there was a review, the process which we undertook as a group, and what the key outcomes were of that review. So for those of you that don't know, the PEPS, Practice Educator Professional Standards, were initially developed by the College of Social Work. However, as you all know, in 2015, when the college closed, there was no one who took responsibility of the PEPS. So in 2017, a survey of stakeholders was undertaken by the PEPS Refresh Group within BASWA, and overall these results showed that there was a support for PEPS values and domains. People wanted it to continue, but there was quite a lot of variation in how it was being delivered. And from that discussion and stakeholder liaison, the PEPS was born in 2019, the PEPS Refresh, and it was updated again in 2020. So it's a live current document. It's not something that just sits on the shelves and doesn't respond to what's happening in the current context. It's something we do have to keep going back to and looking at and seeing that it is still responsive to what social work education looks like in that current context. So where we are now, 2022, BASWA further commissioned a stakeholder review because there were three main areas which they felt, and I agree, that we needed to re-look at. One was in response to the frequently asked questions, which seemed to be an ever-expanding document, and there was lots of similarity in some of the questions that kept coming out. So we thought it was important to integrate those back into the document to make it clearer in the guidance. But also thinking about anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice and how that we can make sure that those values are enshrined within the guidance that practice educators and practice educator trainees had throughout the process. I think it's important at this point, and we probably will discuss this a little bit more, is that work with BASWA nothing sits on its own. It's all interrelated and integrated. And there are two groups that I've been involved in, but not led on, which are important to think about in consideration when we're thinking about practice education and the PEPS. So one of those groups is the Look After Your Practice Educator group, thinking about the conditions and experiences of practice educators and how they can be supported to do their roles and responsibilities within different contexts. And also the Quality Assurance in Practice Learning, yes, another acronym, so the QAPL, the Quality Assurance Group, and the third edition of that was launched in 2021, and Peter is here and he led on that, so I'm sure he'll be able to give us some more detail about that later. But the work on PEPS was done in conjunction, knowing about these pieces of work that were happening, and it was important that they were integrated into the process as well. So what did I do after Wayne kindly asked me to lead on this group? So initially there was a scoping review. So this was by email, and this was a process of reaching out to a variety of people. So people with lived experience, yes, another acronym there, PWLE, people with lived experience, students, employers, independent practice educators, another acronym, HEI, higher education institutions, But in recognition of the fact that PEPS is not only delivered by higher education institutions, we also included learning providers as well. Some of those are independent organisations and some of those sit within employers, largely local authorities. So this initial scoping review was a very large email list, reaching out to people and asking for their feedback on the current PEPS. So where do they feel that there is, they like what it says and does, but where do they feel that they are less clear on the process? Where do they feel it doesn't respond to what practice education looks like now for them in this current context? Because don't forget, of course, the first PEPS was launched before COVID. So that definitely changes around what practice education looks like and how it's delivered in different organisations. So I got back lots of emails. People populated a document for me telling me which paragraphs that they thought they would like to look at. And in my naivety, I thought we would have one lovely big meeting where we talked about this, but it expanded because there was so much to talk about and so many people interested in the process. We actually held 3 stakeholder meetings, and these were held on Teams. So we had representatives of people with lived experience, students, employers, independent practice educators, higher education institution and other learning providers. So there were 3, I think 1.5 hour MS Teams meetings where, after I'd collated all the email feedback, we went through each of the points that were raised and came to a consensus about what do we want to say about this query, for example, and I'll talk about those a bit more in later slides. So we had this consensus opinion about how we wanted PEPS to look and how we wanted it to be delivered within all these different stakeholder experiences, groups, providers. And then I had the joyous experience of collating a draft. So there were several drafts, as Wayne knows. The first draft responded to those 3 stakeholder meetings and created a bit of clarity and a little bit of formatting around how the document looks. One of the things I made a decision on was that the table about the PEPS domains, I moved it to the end because I felt that when you're looking through a document for guidance, it took up quite a lot of space in the middle of the document. So I created it as an appendix at the end so you could get all of the meaty guidance before you got through to the appendices. So I created the first draft and we had representatives, a smaller group, a working group, to look at the draft. So we had a HEI representative, that was Polly, and we had an independent practice educator, we had somebody with lived experience of social work, and we invited an employer, but unfortunately they weren't able to engage in the process. And being a draft, there was more than one draft. I think got to about draft 3 or maybe even 4 before we got a document we were all finally happy with, and we sent that off to Wayne for publishing. So that's the process by which we engage people nationally in the refreshing of the refresh document. So now I'm just going to go through 3 slides which just talk about the main outcomes of this process, this consultation process. So first of all, a key outcome was about embedding values much more. Social work is informed by a clear value base. One of the main outcomes of the review work was to ensure that there was consistent application of these to the training to become a practice educator. And the way in which we did this was twofold. Firstly, we identified where a commitment to anti-oppressive practice in the training of practice educators would be expected, in line as well with the new Code of Ethics from BASWA. And we also looked specifically at the needs of learners, learning styles, experiences of learning prior to coming to university, the assessment process. And what we really wanted to reinforce is ways in which we could have collaboration and partnerships with our learners as well. And also the response to the research in relation to Black learners on placement and the outcomes, which are very troubling, and that we felt that it needed to start at this point where we're actually talking very overtly about these issues and making sure that our practice educator trainees are aware of the issues and responding to them throughout their training. Secondly, we considered the value statements. So whilst they have always been part of the expectations of practice educators, they've not always, I think the group felt, it's not always been as visible in the teaching of assessment and assessment of those undertaking the training. So not only did we review the wording of the value statements to make them more current and responsive to the experience of students on placement, we also integrated them more into the teaching assessment of trainees. So they become more integrated again. I said that word again. But what we did is that we created a mapping document where we looked at the domains, but we also looked at where the values informed as well. So it became much more of a holistic document, an overview of expectations. And all of this work has been underpinned by a really clear commitment to developing partnerships with all of those involved in practice educating, primarily learners and people with lived experience, but also the employers and those providing practice education courses. So that was one of the key outcomes, the fact that we really wanted clear informing by our value base as social workers in the process. And that's not to say it wasn't happening, but it was about making it more overt and visible. Another key outcome was the terminology, which some of you hopefully will be pleased to hear. We will talk about this probably a bit more later, but reviewing the frequently asked questions, it was really clear there were lots of queries in relation to the role of the practice assessor and the mentor and who could do what. So there's clarification on their roles and expectations. Also, we updated the glossary to capture all the varied roles of people involved throughout the learning process and through various routes, because of course we've got the degree of apprenticeship as well. And we also have people on post-qualification learning programs too. So the glossary became updated and our abbreviations and many acronyms, of course, became updated too. And another thing that we talked about a lot was this clarity about the learner and the PEPS trainee, because I think sometimes there were lapses in the way in which we were talking about the learner, the social work learner, and the learner on the trainee course. So throughout the document, we've changed the language, and the PEPS trainee is a person undertaking PEPS trainee, and the person that they are working with is the learner. So the learner might be pre-qualification or post-qualification, but we were really clear about making sure everybody knew the roles and responsibilities there. And finally, another key outcome is clarity of process. So we wanted to have clarity of where responsibilities lie in relation to what the employer has to do, what the PEPS course provider, higher education institution had to do, because there were quite a few questions and queries about who does what and when. So we hope that what we've done there provides a lot more clarity about where the employer has responsibility, but where the course provider has responsibility. We also wanted to give clearer guidance on PEPS 1, PEPS 2 and practice assessors and who signs what and who does what. So we've updated the table to make it really clear who oversees a trainee and at what stage. And one decision we made was that all practice educator trainee work has to be overseen by a practice assessor to a different level, because what we discussed was that somebody could be on a PEPS course, and if they're not having somebody oversee their work, a practice assessor, a practice educator assessor, and then they don't pass the PEPS course, a student has therefore effectively been passed by somebody who isn't qualified to enable that to happen. So that was one decision that we made, which will have implications, but we felt it was an important quality assurance safety net to have there. We've also talked about, we also embedded expectations around the content of learning programmes for PEPS, practice educator professional standards, specifically responding to ethical issues raised in practice learning, such as learning styles, people's different routes into education and anti-racist practice, to enhance the learning experience and get the best out of learners by being supportive and collaborative. We also talked about the expectations around the domains, because one thing that came out of our discussions that evidencing all of the domains in PEPS 1 can sometimes create problems. And I know in the PEPS refresh, the guidance is that all of the domains had to be evidenced at stage 1 and then again at stage 2. But we've incorporated a little bit more wiggle room again in there, because it was felt that domain D, sometimes some elements of it are very difficult to evidence in PEPS 1. Now, it's we've made it clear in the documentation whose responsibility it is to keep an eye on that, to make sure that it's definitely evidenced in PEPS 2. But we felt that this was supportive of not only PEPS trainees and employers, but also students as well, because PEPS 1 trainees might not necessarily work with a student in difficulty, and I think people were finding it hard to evidence that in PEPS 1. So we did create a little bit more wiggle room there, and that's what the group wanted to do. We've also discussed currency and created a bit more clarity on maintaining currency. It's not completely robust because we have to have a bit of flexibility, but it's some more guidance on what can be done to maintain currency and whose responsibility it is to keep an eye on that, as well as lapsed practice educators and whose responsibility it is to keep an eye on that for internal and long arm and independent practice educators. The commitment to developing robust and clear guidance for practice educators in training was outstanding from everybody involved. I was astounded by the amount of people who were invested in this process. It was so heartening to see so many people really invested in getting this right for social work learners. Practice education can be an important and rewarding aspect of career development in social work, and I'm hopeful that not only do the clearer links to the professional standards in this document make that visible, but also that those involved in practice education have the opportunity to showcase their development through their CPD evidence given to Social Work England. So that's the end of my presentation.
Very much, Sarah. And I'd just like to thank you for leading a really comprehensive review of the Practice Educator Professional Standards, the PEPS, and for refining something that's very important, I think, within social work, in terms of social work education frameworks. You've done a fantastic job. As we know, the PEPS and the QAPL, which is the Quality Assurance in Practice Learning, which we'll look at shortly, and also the Professional Capabilities Framework, the PCF, are very much by the profession for the profession, which Sarah alluded to in her presentation. So just to emphasise that. I'd like to bring in now Polly Sykes and Peter Bradley. So I'd like to come to yourself, Peter, with some questions really, and to the group more generally about the process, about the aims and what the future holds. And my first question is, what do you think around the stakeholder engagement process, Peter, given what we've heard in Sarah's presentation? Presumably you were involved in that as well.
Well, I'd just like to echo Sarah's views about the extensive nature of this and how what a brilliant job she did overseeing that in terms of including people. I think it was really challenging, the diversity of views from the different stakeholders. But to pull all that together and to come up with this final document, I think is a real achievement. What I felt was really, really important in terms of looking at the perspectives of people with lived experience was to differentiate between students who are people with lived experience of practice education and placements, and people with lived experience in terms of people that social workers are directly working with. Each need to be valued and their perspectives taken into account. But in terms of this framework, which is primarily to do with preparing practice educators and their interactions with students, I felt it was really, really important to obtain and integrate the views of students into this process. And so I suppose what I need to do is to perhaps explain how we have accommodated both groups. And I think in terms of students, what we need to do is to ensure that the values framework in terms of recognizing the power differential and the different roles of practice educators and students accommodate a good experience of placement, because sadly we were getting some feedback from the students in the group about how they had not had a good experience and felt at times quite oppressed by their practice educator in terms of the power differential. So what we wanted to do was to try to build in at the initial stages of placements clear frameworks so the students can say to people, I'm not very happy with this, or I'm uncomfortable with this, which links in a little bit with QAPL, which I know we'll be dealing with later. And then also to ensure that their views, as they were expressing them in terms of the feedback at the end of the placement, is taken seriously and integrated into program processes. So what we tried to do in terms of the diversity of experiences was to make sure that the views of students were sought and recognised and acknowledged and then integrated into these frameworks. In relation to the second group, the people with lived experience in terms of people that social workers are working with, we also had that group as well, and we felt that it was really important to get their input into overall course design and more general frameworks such as the practice education panel at the end of placements that was looking at standards of placements generally. But in terms of the diversity, you know, we had employers, we had people from universities, we had students, we had people from learning disability, learning experience from a whole range of different areas. So I thought that was really well done.
Excellent. Okay, glad to hear that. And Polly, is there anything you would like to add in terms of stakeholder engagement, either in the process or implementation of the PEPS?
I mean, I would echo what's been said so far, really. I think by approaching it in the different ways that Sarah described, starting with kind of that wider email contact and then the online meetings, the fact that we are so accustomed to working online now, I think has been a real benefit. We've been able to go out and get far more people to be involved. And we had so many people, as Sarah said, who were willing and enthusiastic to be involved. So that was great to see. I mean, obviously, there's pros and cons of being online. Some people do find that it's harder to be involved, but overall I think it gave us opportunities to connect across the country and get a diversity of views that I don't think we would have got in previous times. So
yeah, excellent. And in terms of what I was saying before about sort of by the profession for the profession, I think that's really important, isn't it? That it's really much been led by social work, hasn't it? So very purist in that sense. So thank you. Sarah, is there anything additional you would like to add?
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I just want to do is thank Basra as well for enabling us to have access to your well-known mailing list to promote, because the tendency can be is that you contact the people that you've been involved with before, and therefore that you get a bit of an echo chamber maybe. So being able to through Basra, spread the message wide and far through your contacts, Wayne, was amazing, because it meant that we were able to speak to many more people than had I just relied on my own contacts through other work. Yeah, and as well with Polly, because we both use our groups of people with lived experience, so that was a real added bonus to be able to do that, because they weren't necessarily members of Basra, so they didn't know about it. And obviously you also gave me access to the student group through Basra too. So yeah, I think that was a really important element of getting these varied voices.
Yeah, I think you've done a really good job in terms of pulling all that together, because there must have been some difficult conversations and, you know, tense conversations around priorities and emphasis and all that sort of stuff. So I think you did really well in doing that, and, you know, it's just great to be able to enable that really. So yeah. Okay, so moving on to another question. And I'll aim this one at Sarah initially. How did you integrate different types of lived and living experience and diversity of opinion? I know we've touched on that in some of the last question, but any other thoughts around diversity of opinion and lived or living experience?
Yeah, I think Peter's already touched upon this, but I think the important thing for us was to put students at the centre of this process, and therefore the people who lived experience who were involved in the process, the requirement was they had to have some experience of practice education, because I know people lived experience contribute vastly to social work programs in such an array of ways, but that was one of our requirements, that you had to have some understanding of practice education for students, because we wanted them right at the centre of the process. Yeah. The other thing, the diversity of opinion, yes, it did become challenging at times, because you've got people with different priorities. You've got employers who've got lots of other pressures. You've got some in-house provision, you've got external provision, you've got some that are accredited, some that are not accredited. And so coming to an agreed point of where we were going with certain topics did become a bit challenging, but we did get there in the end. I mean, I don't know if there's anything else, Peter, you want to say about students and people with lived experience. I think, do you feel like that's covered in your previous answer?
Well, I do just think that each programme and partnership need to consider very carefully how to integrate that aspect of the delivery of the programme. And some programmes do that really, really well in terms of how people are involved in committees and processes and such. I'd just like to also just encourage people to who have views watching this video to contribute to the BASWA groups in different ways, because it's, as you were saying, Sarah, the danger is that it seems to be the same group of people doing this, and people from a really broad range of experiences can make such a good contribution to the groups that BASWA has set up, either the student groups or the people with lived experience and whatever. But no, I think there's a limit to the amount we can do in terms of the overall frameworks, apart from facilitate and encourage and remind people that the views of students about their experiences on placement are just so important. And the power differential in particular makes it a very tricky process at times to obtain those views and make use of them carefully, beginning of your placements or the end of placements. But it's just, without that, we're going to end up with situations that we were hearing about where people really did feel that they had had a poor experience, sadly.
Yeah, okay. And Polly, what are your thoughts, please, around that?
I mean, I think that having gone out to such a wide range of people, as we were saying in the last question, we ended up with a great cross section of people within the groups, which was brilliant because it meant we had, you know, people with people from across the country, people with protected characteristics, crucially, since that's one of the things we wanted represented in the updated guidance. So it's really crucial that we had that range of people actually involved in putting together the guidance and giving their perspectives as well. And I think that we were successful in doing that. So yeah.
Okay, excellent. And just to emphasize, from my point of view, sort of helping to facilitate some of this, from my perspective, the involvement of people who use social work services sort of really was integral, wasn't it? And it wasn't just something kind of tokenistic and kind of an added bolt on or something like that. It was integral really from the outset. So, you know, I really have to congratulate Sarah and other people who've been involved in that, really, for that meaningful engagement. I'm conscious of time, so let's move on. I've got another question. What were your thoughts around sort of currency of the PEPS and the regularity of placements for practice educators to maintain their status? And I'll start with Polly on this one, please.
So currency of the qualification was very much a live discussion, which we were all aware of. Everybody involved in the groups spoke a bit. You know, it's something that within teaching partnerships, within employers and universities, we were all trying to work out how do we ensure that, you know, that the qualification is current, that practice educators are supported, but also well prepared to deliver what they were supposed to be delivering, basically. You know, that things hadn't got a bit stale, that they hadn't lost their skills. How do they maintain that? So it was very much something that we wanted to give more guidance on within the PEPS. And one of the things that we tried to take into account, again, was about being quite flexible, about acknowledging that practice educators do a lot of really good work with the students, but also do a lot of work elsewhere with relevant skills that are transferable. So they might be doing some work with people who are on their ASYE year, so first year of employment for people, and a lot of that is transferable through. So we try to capture that a bit with the guidance. So I think that's the main thing I'd say, really. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. And Sarah, anything to add?
Sorry, struggle with my mic there. Yeah, I suppose it's very hard to give definitive guidance, and if people are going to look for that from the document, then they're not going to find it, because what we actually wanted to do is create a bit of flexibility in response to the fact that there are so many things that people do with learners, which creating a list of that would be enormous. But it was more around a case-by-case basis, and also whose responsibility is it to see if somebody's somebody's status is current, and it varies, and that's what the guidance does tell you, is whose responsibility it is if they're an employer or independent practice educator or in a higher education institution or learning provider. So that's where the clarity lies, and I think that what you have to do is work quite collaboratively within your partnerships to discuss these, and I think Peter has also made important points around, you know, keeping an eye on these things so that they don't suddenly say, oh, it's been 2 years, we haven't had a student. So looking at responsibilities in relation to keeping that as a rolling discussion within partnerships as well.
Okay, thank you. And Peter, I have a specific question for you in a moment, but is there anything you'd like to add to what's already been said?
I think coming with a QA background, I recognise the need for flexibility. And on the one hand, you've got the difficulties, the dangers of the process being so onerous that people just don't do it. And the amount of energy involved in doing a course and then assessing it is just ridiculously onerous, or it being so flexible that it's meaningless. And somewhere in the middle, you have to sort of have that framework where there are this flexibility. And in some instances, it's very clear when somebody's a practice educator, they've just finished the course or they've just had students within 2 years. In other instances, it's not so clear. And I think what the document tries to do is to suggest to programs that there are areas where people can show that they can maintain their currency without necessarily having the students. And so I think that's a really good, straightforward way forward. As Sarah says, I think it's so important for the programs and partnerships to be proactive in this area and to have processes to be monitoring, recording and promoting practice educators, so that they're aware of the numbers that are going to be available, so that when the placements arrive, it's not sort of panic stations in terms of, oh my goodness, this person hasn't had a student for 3 years. We'll have to give one to them anyway, when actually that perhaps is not as robust as it should be. So it's about that partnership and the individual responsibility of practice educators to make sure that they maintain their currency, but also for their programs and partnerships to promote that as well.
Okay, thank you. And as I say, I had a question specifically for you anyway, Peter, around how the PEPS aligns with the QAPL, which is the Quality Assurance in Practice Learning Framework. I am conscious of time though, so could I ask you just to keep it quite brief, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Clearly, these two frameworks are really interlinked in so many different ways, and we've recently had the QAPL refresh, and the 9 stages of the placements that have come out of that with the different templates are specifically important for students and practice educators in relation to how placements are set up, and then the feedback that occurs, and then what has happened with the feedback. So I would urge people to familiarise themselves with the templates. If they have any issues about them being quirky, to feedback to us, because we have the facility to review these annually. But hopefully that will provide the tools for practice educators and partnerships to promote good quality placements and good quality practice educators in a whole range of different ways for the benefits of students and ultimately people with lived experience.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. And just to emphasise that both the PEPS documentation and the QAPL documentation is available on the BASBA website. Is there anything specifically around the QAPL that either Polly or Sarah that you want to add? No? Okay. My final question is around the direction of travel, really, of social work education and how this fits with the PEPS. And again, conscious of time, so could I just ask for maybe a sentence from each of you around that? And I'll come to Polly first, please.
So as we all know, social work education can change quite quickly, guidance can change quite quickly. So with regards to the PEPS, really, it was something we bore in mind, is that the same as with the PCF itself, it's a live document, it can change. We've tried to be really robust with it, but we've also tried to be quite flexible, and we're aware that, you know, that we might need to come back to it if needed. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Polly. And Sarah?
Yeah, I suppose I know we've said it a few times, but this has been a profession-led document, and that's the way we want it to stay. So whatever happens in the future, it cannot happen without consultation of people involved in practice education at all levels that we've already talked about. So, and yeah, as Polly says, we've tried to build in flexibility where possible, because nobody knows what the future looks like. But it's important it stays close to home. I think that's my point.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like it's important that whatever is on the horizon is compatible with existing frameworks like the PEPS. So yeah, thank you for that. And Peter, any final thoughts from yourself in terms of direction of travel of social work, education, and also how the PEPS fits with that?
Well, I'm conscious of being around for an awful long time in relation to practice education, thinking back to the old Setswood days when practice education course was sort of emerged and things like that. And despite all the rapid changes and the need and the political pressures and things like that, what comes across for me is that the central feedback from students about how valuable their placements were and how central they were in order for them to become good social workers. And so what for me is the sort of consistent message is, how do we make sure that practice education is of the highest quality that we can in terms of the learning opportunities provided, and then the standard and the support that practice educators are actually providing in terms of the sort of educational experience, their knowledge, how they can promote the skills, how they can manage the power differential, and how they can, over that 70 or 100 days, really enable that social work student to end up being a good social worker. And it's amazing how consistent and how how those themes continue to emerge irrespective of the frameworks we're working within.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and thank you to Sarah and to Polly as well. So that's the end of this recording. I'd just like to draw people's attention to the Professional Capabilities and Development Group at BASWA that we have, that oversees these different frameworks, including the PEPS, but also the QAPL that we've talked about, and the PCF, the Professional Capabilities Framework. So thank you for watching.